thought that we would discover 100 years of Goan poetry, and I thought we would have about an hour. This is one of the joys of our festival in Goan. We have about 20 minutes. So, and we have to cover poetry which has been written in so many languages, in English, in Portuguese, in Konkani, in Marathi. I know so little about the Konkani and Marathi poetry, though I can read some of it. That is why we have Mr. Madhav Bodkar here, who is himself a poet. So until Eunice comes, Madhav, let me talk to you. Could we have another?
You can use the mic on the stand. Take it on the back.
Poetry has progressed over the last century or so. The way poetry was written in the 19th century or the 20th century is very different from what is being done today. Have you seen that progression in Konkani and Marathi poetry?
Thank you very much, Mr. Rivero. In fact, I feel very happy to be with you today. And to be very frank, Goan poetry in Marathi and Konkani has taken rapid strides over the past, I say, 70 years or so. If you go into the history of Goan poetry in these two languages, let's take Marathi first, because Konkani poetry developed much later. A good deal of poetry that was written in Marathi was very much derivative in nature. Most of our Marathi poets, Goan poets, had these same poets or Pandit poets in Marathi as their role models. And they were very particular about the structural, prosaic aspect of poetry. But you find a great change when we have a poet like P.B. Bodkar or Bakibab Bodkar, who as was popularly known. In 1926, he started writing, and there was a lot of change in his poetry. I always describe him as a genuine Goan poet. Although we claim that Goan poetry has a tradition of 400 years, it may be true, historically true, but from the literary point of view, you find a big change when Bodkar appeared on the scene. It was not just a derivative poetry, but there was something genuine about it. One important aspect of this poetry, these poets, you must think, he was not writing in his own language. A language was an alien language, and not his mother tongue. So you find initially he was struggling with the language itself and then the prosaic part of it. Although he had some role models, highly influential, and you may call it a imitative poetry, but there was something original about Bodkar's poetry, and gradually it flowered and became mature when Bodkar was in his 30s and 40s. It was genuine poetry, and he came out of this influence of Marathi poets, especially Bharat Tambe. He was very much enamored of Bharat Tambe's poetry. And he was a genuine poet, I say, for another reason. From 1926 to 1984, when he passed away, he was a poet to the core. He thought he was a poet to every inch. Of course, there are so many, what you call, strings to his poetic bow, and primarily he was a lyricist, lyric poet, but he added some social rhetoric to his poetry, and that also found quite genuine and very interesting. There's another poet who had to struggle for a longer time. That was Shankar Ramani. He was highly individualistic poet, abstract, and there are so many other aspects. Very hard nut to crack. Very difficult poet, and his poetry became more and more difficult with time. You may call his poetry influenced by French symbolists like Rimbaud or Verlaine, all those poets. And at the same time, he carried away Indian poetic tradition. So I consider these two poets as a main poets. There was another poet called Damodar Chutkare, but unfortunately he discontinued writing poetry in his early 30s. He was a contemporary of Borkar. Coming to Konkani poetry, both the poets are bilingual. Borkar wrote in Marathi and Konkani as well, so also Ramani. And in both the languages they showed their competence. Coming to Konkani poetry, it had a late beginning, and it's because of several reasons. I think it was discussed why the Konkani literature flowered little late. But you can say historically, this Konkani poetry in Goa took rapid strides only after the liberation of Goa, when the condition was a little conducive and favorable for its growth. And here you find three main poets: B.B. Borkar, then Manohar Rai Sardes and R.V. Pandit. These three poets really shaped Goan poetry, and then again after in the 70s, you have a new generation of poets coming up. I belong to that particular generation. Then I have with me Prakash Padgaonkar, Ramesh Vyuskar, and so many other poets, which some of them are major, some of them are quite minor poets. But all these three, let's say, this generation wrote with a different tone. Of course, they carried the tradition of their predecessors. You can say Borkar, Ramani, and Bhangi. There's another very important name is Bhangi, who was greatly influenced by the poetry of Fernando Pessoa, great Portuguese poet. And he has translated Pessoa into Konkani. And temperamentally, these two poets come very close. Then you have a host of women poets, which was not so prior to, say, liberation of Goa. You hardly find one or two women poets, but after the liberation, after 1970, you find many women poets writing both in Marathi and in Konkani. So, and you find that they are all obsessively preoccupied with their problems. You may call it feminist poetry also. Recently, there is one magazine called Lalit, published in Marathi. They have brought out special issues on, say, poetry, drama, novels, etc. And I was going through the Marathi poetry of the last 50 years, and I was really shocked to see the omission of Goan Marathi writing. Then a question arose to my mind. What about our contribution to Marathi poetry? Why? Not a single poet has, they don't find a place in the last 50 years. Although Shankar Ramani was a major poet in this particular period. Especially his poetry flowered in very late age, and that too after 60, his contribution is quite significant. Yeah. Yeah.
Could this be for political reasons?
I don't think that it is because of the political reason, but they always considered Goan poetry, Marathi poetry, not as a Marathi poetry. That is the acceptance of Konkani poets into their canon. They always describe this poet as Goan poets writing in Marathi. Yeah, that may be the reason why. It may have some sociological reasons more than the political. Yeah.
Can you mentioned the influence of the French poet Fernando Pessoa, who's a very different poet to me in Portuguese. Some of it is like T.S. Eliot or beyond that. Technically more advanced, linguistically more abstract and advanced.
Yeah.
Can you recite some Konkani poetry in Portuguese? Your own poetry.
I am very good at remembering lines, but you have maybe Borkar's poem, त्या दिसा वडाकडेन गडद थिंसना मंद मंद वाजत आयली तुझी गो पांजना. That very famous poem and set to tune by Jitendra Abhisheki, a very popular poem not only in Goa, but this poem was oft-quoted by his critics, Marathi critics, and whenever he participated in any conference, there was demand from the audience to recite this particular poem. Yeah.
Can you translate?
It is about the enclaves, they are here, it is evening, and under the banyan, I am standing under the banyan tree, and suddenly I hear your anchorage. It is a very, very subtle and very beautiful, intensely lyrical expression of love. And Borkar was well known for that, especially his poem in Marathi called Japani Ramala Chira, very sensuous. His language was very sensuous and he was very deep. If you read his poetry, you will realize the subtle aesthetic nuances of his poetry, which is highly untranslatable into any other language, especially English or any European language. Perhaps better in Hindi. Even some people have tried to translate his poetry into Hindi, but we don't get that flavor of the original Marathi. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You have had a very long innings as a poet in English and been published extensively. including translation into Portuguese and perhaps other languages. What changes have you seen in English poetry written by Goan?
I'm familiar mainly with the modern poets, though there's one I know quite well from the 19th century. His name is Joseph Hurtado, and he was one of the first poets writing in English to use what we now call Indian English. He's from the village of Pilern, and we went there the last time I was here to look for his grave, but we couldn't find it, which was rather sad, because I'm quite interested in learning as much as I can about him. But I would say that with the modern poets, mainly writing from the 70s, most of us in Bombay, we don't think of ourselves as Goan poets, though we are Goan. We think of ourselves as poets. That makes life much simpler, because you then don't feel you have to be obviously Goan all the time. As it so happens, my first poems were about growing up in a Goan community. They are not at all flattering to Goans, I'm afraid. I've been looking at all the magazines about Goa. Goa is this and Goa is that. But they don't tell you a great many things which are still happening. You know, the caste system, the refusal of one caste to marry into another, the superiority of South Goa Brahmins to Bharatiya Brahmins. We don't share any of this. Victor, shall I read just one part? This is my earliest lot, which turned up quite suddenly. I wasn't planning to be a poet. I didn't have a single line of poetry in my mind. But I heard an aunt say to a visitor, oh, the engagement was broken off because they discovered he wasn't a Brahmin. That was a nasty shock. Well, later I discovered that of course we share all these foibles with quite a number of other communities. But to begin with, this poem is called Marriages Are Made, and it's based on a real experience of one of my cousins who was being viewed as a potential bride. It's called Marriages Are Made. My cousin Elena is to be married. The formalities have been completed. Her family history examined for TB and madness. Her father declared solvent. Her eyes examined for squints. Her teeth for cavities. Her stools for the possible non-Brahmin worm. She is not quite tall enough and not quite full enough. Children will take care of that. Her complexion, it was decided, would compensate, being just about the right shade of rightness. To do justice to Francisco ex Noronha Prabhu, good son of Mother Church.
can be devastating.
It was meant to be devastating.
Very unsettling. It should be put down with a firm hand. No?
I was told by one of my students that when this first book appeared, I was condemned from the pulpit at St. Peter's Church in Bandra. And a fellow poet, Adil Jasawala, told me, if I continued as I was going, I would soon be denounced from St. Peter's in Rome. Yeah.
Fortunately, not by the new Pope.
No.
But we will have had to wait a long time.
In the meantime, I would have been burned at the stake, probably.
In effigy, not in person. Well, amongst the many things that have happened, you have been teaching at St. David's College. What is the reaction of the young people there? You could say very openly now, as a matter of pride, I am a poet. Am I right?
Yeah.
And did they want to be poets themselves as well?
A few. I don't think it's sort of any kind of universal craving.
Oh, excuse me, in Goa, everybody wants to be a poet. Am I right, Vivek?
A writer at least.
Or a-
No, it was nothing like that, but they enjoyed listening to or reading poetry. One or two of my students, not because they were my students, but they turned into wonderful poets. There's Melanie Slugado, who along with Raul de Camarose, Santan Rodriguez, were quite important in the 1970s. They started a poets cooperative for publishing poetry. Just a little earlier, Adil Jasawala, Gil Patel, Arvind Krishna Mehrotra, Arun Kulatkar had started one called Clearinghouse, but that was for poetry in general. And then Melanie and the others started one called New Ground. And they published first their book, called Three Poets, then mine, called Fix, and a couple of others, Salim Peridana, and so on. So they were very instrumental, first of all in helping to publish poetry, and secondly, we organized in the
Did you do that? I saw you stand up, the lights went out.
We organized in St. Xavier's College quite a number of readings in which well-known poets who were just beginning, read their work. So those were good times in the 70s. I mean, it's very odd to discover that we are being considered history now. We've had a number of foreign scholars coming to talk to us about the 70s, as if we were all somehow a little fossilized. I'm of course hobbling around because of my knee, but basically it's very odd to be alive and sort of kicking and discovering that we are now part of the history of poetry.
I pick up on that. We have divisions in critical analysis, and you are post-colonial. I am pre-post-colonial. But they haven't heard of that classification, so please help me to establish that. If they're thinking of the 1970s with you, they have to think of the 1940s with me. Time marches on. Fortunately, we can still make some sort of contribution and add some perspective to what is happening now. You read one poem of yours. One of the great things that I found in the poetry that is being written by Goans today is they can use, our poets can use very simple language to do extraordinary things with it. Because It is the way in which they look at the commonplace and turn it into something that is related to human experience. How many people here own a cat? How many own a dog? Lots of people own dogs. Why don't people own cats? I'll tell you why people don't own cats. They will tell you, oh, dogs are so loving. Cats don't care about you. Eunice has written a poem about cats teaching us lessons on how to live. I'm going to read. If I find it. It's called Advice to Women. Because cats are feminine after all, right? Advice to women. Keep cats if you want to learn to cope with the otherness of lovers. Otherness is not always neglect. Cats return to their litter trays when they need to. Cats don't cuss out of the windows at their enemies. That stare of perpetual surprise in those great green eyes will teach you to die alone. Wonderful. There are other bits of poetry written by people who are now so Goan that they are Goan, but they came in from other parts of India. Manohar is one of them. Manohar Shetty. Manohar, I think he may have disappeared when I knew that I'd be here. He has written something on model shows, fashion shows. I don't think any man here will admit to watching fashion shows, right? We never watched something like that. But when you see these tall, thin young women walking out onto the stage, it's like it's a production. Their feet move in peculiar ways, this way. Their eyes stare straight ahead. Their faces are frozen. Let me read what Manohar has done. He calls it catwalk. High-heeled birds of paradise stalk the ramp, legs crisscrossing shears, their hawk eyes frozen on camera wear the mascara of tigers. Their faces are expressionless, but inside they are tigers. Is it time for us to wind up?
Yes, 2 minutes.
2 minutes more. Any questions from the audience? Yes? No?
If no questions, audience, I will ask one question. We haven't touched Portuguese poetry, Goan Portuguese poetry. Interestingly, you find so many Goan Portuguese poets writing on Indian themes. They have drawn heavily on Indian epics like Mahabharata and Ramayana. Why so? To name two important poets, Ajodat Barret and Nascimento Mendonça. These two poets are major Portuguese poets. What may be the possible reason?
They feel the roots are here, right? And I sometimes feel a great emptiness inside me because I do not know enough about our previous epics, our culture. I have read Homer, but I have not read the Ramayana in the original. They felt this connection and they wanted to express themselves in terms of their roots. So thank you all for coming.